The last battle is the story of a unique fight that took place during the last few days of World War II in Europe in an Austrian castle on May 4th and 5th, 1945. It is the only documented case in World War II when American and German soldiers fought together against a common enemy. I first learned about this story some 30 years ago when I was a staff historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. Another historian with whom I worked, a gentleman named Dr. Alfred Beck, had heard about the story and was compiling a file on it, although he was very busy at that time and wasn't going to have the chance to do anything with it, so he offered the file to me, and of course I said yes. And then I immediately put the file away for 30 years because I had various jobs, I had a family, and then I brought it back out in 2004 and started working on it again. And then in 2008, Weider History Group's World War II magazine published an article based on the research I'd done. And then about 4 years later, I realized that it needed to be a book. So I went back, did more extensive research, and wrote the book. Schloss Idar, as it's called in German, sits on a ridge overlooking the Inn Valley, the valley of the Inn River in Austria. The first structure on that ridge was built in the 9th century, and it's been enlarged and fortified over the years. The castle has been variously a fortification, a private home, and a hotel. In 1943, the Nazis took it over to serve as what they called a special prison, to house what they termed honor prisoners. These were people of political value that they would hope to be using later as hostages or to exchange for high-level German prisoners. At Castle Idar there were 14 French prisoners, 10 men and 4 women. Among the men were 2 former prime ministers, Paul Reynaud and Edward Daladier, General Maurice Gamelin and General Maxime Weygand, 2 former chiefs of staff of the French army. There was a very senior labor leader. There was a gentleman who in the interwar period had been probably the leader of the largest fascist party in France. And there were a couple of people who were only there because they were related to people who were in the Free French movement. Charles de Gaulle, for example, his sister was one of the prisoners. Castle Idar was not a concentration camp. It was not a work camp. It was actually a very nice place to be held if you had to be a prisoner. There were 3 square meals a day and all the wine these French folks could drink. The French prisoners at Castle Idar needed protecting because on May 4th, 1945, the German guard force that had been guarding them for the previous 3 years evaporated into the countryside because the Allies were advancing. At that point, you have to understand that Austria was still a very, very dangerous place. Although the war was virtually over, there were still many units, especially Waffen-SS units, that were resisting the advancing Allies. So in the forests and the mountains around the castle, there were roving bands of armed men who didn't want to give up yet. Himmler had ordered an SS unit that was operating in the area to go to the castle and execute everybody in it, French and anybody else they could find. The Americans involved in the rescue mission to Castle Idar were from the 23rd Tank Battalion, which was part of the U.S. 12th Armored Division. The division and the battalion, as its lead unit, had struck south from Munich and had crossed the German-Austrian border at a town called Kufstein, which is 13 miles from the castle. The particular American involved was a first lieutenant named Jack Lee, John C. Lee, known to his men as Jack. He was the commander of Company B of the 23rd Tank Battalion. He and his men had stopped in this town of Kufstein because, like the rest of the American army, they thought the war was over and they were going to go into a defensive position. They were essentially in that defensive position when, on the afternoon of May 4th, they saw a German Kubelwagen, a military jeep, driving towards them and an officer in the back of it waving a big white flag. This gentleman, he was a major named Josef Gangl, a Wehrmacht major, told Jack Lee about this nearby castle and about the French people who were being held in it, or who had been held in it, who were now in danger. And he said that he didn't have enough men to undertake a rescue, and he asked Jack Lee to help him. And Jack Lee, being a sort of a cigar-chewing, hard-drinking, hard-charging tanker, said, sure. Joseph Sepp Gangl was a Wehrmacht major, a German army major, and a highly decorated one. He'd fought the Russians on the Eastern Front, and he'd fought the Allies after Normandy, all the way across France, through Germany, and into Austria. But at some point, and we're not sure when, he decided that he wasn't going to fight for the Nazis anymore. He'd never, as far as we know, been a member of the party. So he had been put in command of a unit based on a small village called Virgil, which is only a few miles from Castle Itter. And at some point, while he was the commander, he started supporting the anti-Nazi Austrian resistance. He provided them with weapons, he warned them of SS roadblocks and ambushes. And that's why, at that point, he decided to help protect these French people. I think part of the reason we haven't heard this story before now is because it was actually a very small story on the last 2 days of a very large war. You have to remember that a lot was happening in Europe at that point. Hitler had been dead for several days. Germany was collapsing. The only way we really ended up hearing about this was that there was a young reporter and a photographer who went along with part of the rescue mission and later wrote about it. I think it would make an excellent movie, and in fact, that process is sort of underway. The book has been optioned by a very well-known screenwriter in Los Angeles named Bryce Zabel, and there is quite a bit of interest in it. I was in the Army for 3 years, from 1971 until 1974. I started out as an infantryman and ended that period as a radio and TV broadcast specialist. I have 2 degrees in history from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and I've worked as a military historian and also as a military journalist. For 18 years I was on the staff of Soldiers magazine, the official magazine of the United States Army, and for the last 5.5 years I've been lucky enough to work here at the Weider History Group.